One of the first discoveries one makes when one begins to look seriously at world history is the centrality of China in all of world history. For 2.5 millennia, 2,500 years, China has been one of the premier, often the central civilization in all human experience. And one gauge of that is that Chinese population 2,000 years ago and today was roughly 1/4 of the population of the whole world, 1/5 to 1/4 through most of history. China also built the greatest bureaucracies, had the largest armies, created a civil service a millennium and a half before Europeans even thought of the idea, had the most productive agrarian system in the world, 6 times more productive than the wheat-growing areas of Europe in the 18th and 19th century, was superb in engineering. Most of our basic bridge designs were worked out by the Chinese, invented gunpowder, paper, printing, all the things that you can think of. It was also exquisite. They produced exquisite art and architecture and 2 of the great philosophical systems of the world. Most surprising to me is the way in which China developed commerce and commercial instruments. In fact, it's almost impossible to think about capitalism or any sophisticated economy without thinking of the things that the Chinese pioneered a half a millennium or a whole millennium ago. This is all the more surprising because in Chinese society, the people who mattered were the imperial court, the people who had power were the imperial court and the scholar gentry, the bureaucrats who ran the country. Military to some extent, but merchants were low. Merchants were low class. In fact, peasants were ranked because they were productive. They were not seen to be productive. Peasants were ranked higher in terms of status. They weren't richer, but they were higher in status than the merchants. So the fact that China excels in commerce, as I said, capitalism or socialist economies are almost unthinkable without the accomplishments of the Chinese. And just to name a few of the key things, to give you a sense of the importance of this, one of them is that the state is responsible for commerce, for trade, for standard weights and measures, for building roads, for providing transport. China had the greatest ships in the world. Columbus's ships were dwarfed by the great junks. It's a funny name. It sounds like they're trivial things, but they were massive ships. The Chinese invent watertight compartments. They're the first to use a compass for navigation. They have ships that can sail across the Pacific. Whether they did or not before Columbus is not clear, but certainly they had the ships that were capable of doing that. As I said, they also provide infrastructure, superb infrastructure, canals and roadways and the rest for trade on land. Almost all of the major instruments, banks, paper currency, credit, just take those 3 and imagine commerce, modern commerce or capitalism without those. All of those are pioneered by the Chinese. All of them are developed centuries before they are in the West or other places. So that China historically, some people often think of China as this isolated place. It's, yes, it's a great civilization. We know it was a great civilization because that's where Columbus was going. Even though he talks about the Indies, because that's where the spices were, the place he really wants to go is China, because Marco Polo had been there and said, there's nothing like it in the world. It's unimaginable as a civilization. So that China historically was one of the great poles of the Silk Road that goes through overland. It was one of the great seafaring and mercantile. It was one of the key players in the Indian Ocean, the vast Indian Ocean trading system. It was a manufacturing area. This is also very important. Silks, porcelain, tea, a whole series of things that the Chinese produced, and China mainly took in raw materials. So China was first world in those terms, and much of the rest of the world was third world, providing raw materials for manufactured goods. And China was just, I think, one of the great gauges all the way back to Roman times, and now today, the Chinese were the trade surplus always went in China's favor. The Romans were very, very worried about the flow of gold and bullion and other things to China. Today, of course, much of the United States is the most powerful economy in the world. Still, much of that economy is controlled by the Chinese.